Diane Kessler leaned across the table in front of 30 people and gave him the ultimatum that had never once failed her in 19 years. Take the pay cut or quit. And Walter Doyle didn't say a word. That's the part nobody in that room was ready for. Not one word. No argument, no protest, no "you can't do this to me," no "I have a daughter." None of the 1,000 desperate sentences that every other person had ever produced when Diane Kessler pulled that particular trigger. Walter Doyle simply sat there for about 2 seconds, looking at her, a look nobody in that room could read. And then he did the strangest, quietest, most devastating thing any of them had ever seen a man do. He closed the folder in front of him, both hands, the way you'd close a book you'd finished. And that small paper sound was somehow the loudest thing that had ever happened in that building. Then he stood up. He picked up his gray canvas bag from under the table, the one with his lunch cooler and a photo of his daughter tucked in the side pocket, and he zipped it shut, slow, unhurried, the way a man moves when he's not in a rush and not in a rage. He picked his jacket off the back of the chair. He slung the bag over his shoulder, and Walter Doyle walked toward the door. Conference Room B had a glass wall that looked out over the machine floor, and through it, 40-some men in Navy work shirts, his crew, his people, the men he'd run that floor with for 12 years, had stopped working to watch. They saw the CEO's mouth moving. They saw their supervisor close a folder. They saw him stand up and pick up a bag, and they had no idea what they were watching. Diane Kessler's face was doing something it had never done in 19 years of being the most effective operator in that company. Because that sentence, "take the pay cut or quit," had a perfect record. It always worked. It worked because she never aimed it at someone who could afford to hear it. She checked. She always checked, and she had checked this one very carefully. Walter Doyle, single father, one income, a 12-year-old daughter at home, no cushion, the most leashed man in the entire building, which was exactly why she'd chosen him to go first. He stopped at the door. "Walter!" Her voice had lost its edge. "Walter, stop! Think about Rosie!" There it was, out loud, in front of 30 witnesses. "You have no savings. You have no other job. What happens to a man like you if you walk through that door?" He turned around. He still said nothing. He just looked at her steady, calm, and most terrifying of all, not angry, and gave one small nod, the kind you'd give someone who's asked a question and you've decided they haven't earned the answer. Then he opened the door and walked out onto the machine floor, past his own men, who parted for him in confused silence, past the lathes he'd run for 12 years, and out of the building. The glass door swung shut behind him. Diane Kessler stood there in the wreckage of a sentence that had never failed before, in front of 30 stunned witnesses, and had absolutely no idea that in the next 90 seconds, everything she believed about people had already started coming apart. Now you're going to want to know the number. 22%, effective the 1st of next month. You're going to want to know why a man with a kid and no backup didn't even try to negotiate it. You'll find out in a few minutes, and when you do, you'll understand exactly why he never said a word. But first, you need to understand the woman who was certain he couldn't say no. Here's what you need to know about Diane Kessler before you can understand what just happened in that room. She had one theory about people, and she'd never have said it out loud in a deposition, but she'd have defended it with total conviction. Everyone has a number, not a salary, a survival number. The rent, the car note, the kids' braces, the specific dollar figure a person needs every single month or their whole life comes apart. And Diane understood with a clarity that had carried her from a regional HR desk in Dayton to the top labor seat at Briggs Foundry Group in 19 years that a man tied to a monthly number doesn't actually get to have principles. He gets to have hopes. And here's the ugly thing. It isn't stupid. It's mostly true, which is what made her so good at this. Diane didn't manage people, she managed leverage. She found out what a person couldn't afford to lose, and she made sure she knew she was holding it, and then she gave the order. And it worked. It had worked on 11 other supervisors already that quarter, quietly, one at a time, in smaller rooms. Sign the new pay grade, take the cut, no severance if you walk. 10 of the 11 had signed. The 12th was supposed to be the easy one, the example, because Walter Doyle wasn't just any name on a spreadsheet. He was the senior man, 12 years on the floor, the one the other supervisors watched before they made a move. If Walter took the cut without a fight, the last name on the list would fall in line by Friday without Diane ever having to say a word to him directly. So she'd pulled his file the way she'd pulled everyone's file before she called them in. Employee number 4471. Base rate $41 an hour, second shift lead, Building C. One dependent listed, Rosie Doyle, age 12, Cheney Middle School. Direct deposit into a single account at First National Community Bank of Youngstown. No second account on record, no garnishments, no history of debt trouble. And also, as far as payroll history could show her, nothing put away either. A 2009 Ford F-150 registered in his name, no other vehicle. A rental on Lincoln Avenue, same address for 9 years. On paper, Walter Doyle was perfect. Perfect the way a target is perfect. No wife's income as backup, no visible cushion, no obvious alternative. A man whose entire professional identity was tied up in one plant, with a daughter depending on him who could not possibly afford to lose that paycheck. She'd chosen him because of it. That's the part you need to sit with. She didn't put him first on the list because he deserved to go first. She put him first because she was sure he couldn't refuse. Rosie was the reason she picked him. Rosie was the leash. She'd called him into conference room B on a Wednesday morning, 30 people in the room, because Diane liked doing these things in the open. A public fold is worth 10 private ones. It teaches everyone else in that room what happens if they don't sign. She slid the folder across the table. 22% reduction, effective the 1st of next month. New title, line coordinator, instead of floor supervisor. Same duties, same hours, same 12 years of experience, worth 22% less starting in 3 weeks because Briggs Foundry Group had decided in a meeting Walter never been in that supervisor pay across the plant was misaligned with regional benchmarks. He read it. He looked up. He said no. She was so surprised she almost laughed. And then, on reflex, on 19 years of muscle memory, she pulled the leash. Take the pay cut or quit. And the most trapped man on that floor closed the folder, stood up, picked up his bag, and walked out without saying one more word. Here's what the 22% actually meant in numbers, because vague numbers don't wreck a person's life. Exact ones do. Walter Doyle made $41 an hour. Full-time, that was roughly $85,000 a year before taxes. 22% off that was almost $19,000 gone. Not gone slowly, gone the 1st of next month, on the same paycheck that covered rent on Lincoln Avenue, insurance on a truck with 214,000 miles on it, and whatever it cost to keep a 12-year-old girl in soccer cleats and school lunches and a winter coat that still fit. $19,000 a year is not something you absorb. It's something you restructure your whole life around, quietly, the way people do when they're embarrassed about it. Fewer groceries, a canceled trip, a conversation with a kid about why she can't do the thing her friends are doing this year. That's what Diane Kessler asked Walter Doyle to accept without a word of protest. And she'd checked his file and decided with real confidence that he had no choice but to say yes. She was wrong. And the reason she was wrong is sitting in a bank account she never found, in a bank 40 minutes from Youngstown, under a name that wasn't his. You'll want to know about that account. It's the best idea in this whole story, and it took Walter 11 years to build, one boring, deliberate decision at a time, starting the week Rosie was born. Now, you're going to want to know why he could afford to say no. And the answer starts 11 years ago in a break room that doesn't exist anymore, at a company that doesn't exist anymore either. Before Briggs Foundry, Walter Doyle worked at Trumbull Precision Machining on Salt Springs Road, a smaller shop, 40 employees, run by a man named Ed Yarnall. Walter was 23,
Rosie was 2 weeks old, and Walter watched something happen in that break room that changed the entire direction of his life. There was a machinist there named Carl Vance, 44 years old, 3 kids, a mortgage on a house out in Cortland. Good man, careful man, the kind of guy who checked his own work twice before he checked yours. And one Tuesday, the plant manager told Carl Vance to sign off on an inspection report for a batch of parts that hadn't actually passed inspection. Told him quietly, in an office, the way these things always get told. Carl said no at first. Walter heard it through a wall that wasn't as thick as everybody thought. And then the plant manager said the thing plant managers say, that the alternative was Carl's position, and Carl had 3 kids, and the mortgage didn't pay itself. Carl Vance signed the report. Walter watched him do it, watched his face while he did it because Carl didn't want to, because he couldn't afford not to. And Walter went home that night to a 2-week-old daughter and a wife who'd be gone within the year, and he sat at his kitchen table on Lincoln Avenue and understood something most people never quite put into words. Most people don't do the wrong thing because they're bad. They do it because they can't afford to be good. And the world is built to keep it that way. A man 3 missed paychecks from disaster doesn't have principles. He has hopes. He'll do what he's told, and he'll hate himself, and he'll do it anyway, because the alternative is his kid losing the house. Walter Doyle, 23 years old and scared, made a decision at that table. He decided he'd never be Carl Vance. And he understood, this is the part that matters, not being Carl Vance wasn't about being braver or more principled. It was arithmetic. You don't become unownable by wanting to. You become unownable slowly over years in the most boring way there is. So that's what he did. He kept the truck, the Ford F-150, bought used in 2011 for $6,000, and he drove it for the next 13 years instead of trading it in, because a car payment is a link in a leash. He stayed in the rental on Lincoln Avenue instead of buying more house than he needed, because a big mortgage is the strongest leash ever built. He didn't take vacations. He didn't get the new phone every 2 years. He bought Rosie's clothes second-hand at the consignment shop on Belmont, and he fixed things instead of replacing them. And every single month, quietly, without telling a single person, not his coworkers, not his friends, not Rosie, Walter Doyle moved $300 into an account in a credit union in Warren, Ohio, 20 minutes from where he lived, under the name Doyle Family Reserve. He wasn't saving for a house. He wasn't saving for retirement. He was saving for one conversation. The conversation he knew, from that night listening through a break room wall, was coming eventually for every working man. The day someone with power over him would look him in the eye and tell him to accept something wrong and make it very clear what it would cost him to refuse. 11 years, $300 a month, some months more when overtime came through. By the time Diane Kessler slid that folder across the table in Conference Room B, the Doyle Family Reserve held $61,400, enough to cover a year of rent, insurance, groceries, and Rosie's school expenses without a single paycheck coming in. A year to find another shop that would take a 12-year floor supervisor. A year that meant nobody on earth could put a number in front of him and make him fold. He'd said it to himself more times than he could count, standing in that garage on Lincoln Avenue changing his own oil because an oil change is $80 he didn't need to spend. Everybody thinks courage is a moment. It isn't. Courage is a balance sheet. Don't buy things. Buy the ability to say no. And then there's Rosie. Rosie Doyle was 12, and she had spent most of her life quietly, resentfully embarrassed by her father. And it's the truest and saddest part of this whole story, because Rosie didn't know about the Doyle Family Reserve. Walter had never told her. How do you explain that to a kid? So all Rosie ever saw was the truck other parents smirked at in the pickup line at Cheney Middle School. The birthday party she couldn't have at the trampoline place because it was $40 a head. The winter coat from the consignment shop with somebody else's name still on the tag inside the collar. The dad who said we can't afford that about things that other poorer-looking families somehow always seem to manage. Rosie loved her father. She'd also built, the way 12-year-olds do, a small hard knot of shame about him. My dad is the guy who never spends money on anything. She'd never said it out loud. Walter had known about it for years anyway, and had swallowed it and had kept saving, because Walter Doyle had made a bet 11 years earlier that someday something would happen that would make his daughter understand. That day was a Wednesday, and at 10:25 that morning, Walter Doyle closed a folder in Conference Room B and walked out of Briggs Foundry Group. And the reason he could do it, the reason he didn't have to fold like Carl Vance folded 11 years before him, the reason he didn't even have to argue, was sitting in an account in Warren, Ohio, built out of a decade of an old truck and skipped birthday parties and a daughter's quiet embarrassment. He had bought the right to say no. It was the most expensive thing he ever purchased and the only thing he ever needed.
Here's what it looked like from the factory floor, because context is the whole thing. The men in Building C didn't hear a word that got said in Conference Room B. All they saw was this. The CEO comes down personally on a Wednesday with the door open. She and Walter talk. It gets short. And then Walter, their supervisor, the man who'd run that floor for 12 years, who knew every one of their kids' names, who'd covered shifts for half of them when a wife went into labor or a father went into hospice, closes a folder, picks up his bag, and walks straight past all of them without a word, without even looking at them, and leaves the building. On the exact week, rumors of a pay restructuring had already started moving through the plant like smoke under a door. You know exactly what 40 rattled men concluded. He saw what was coming, he got his, and he got out. 12 years, and the man didn't even say goodbye. Nobody knew the cut had only ever had his name on it that morning. Nobody knew he'd been the first of 12, the test case, the man Diane Kessler needed to fold so the other 11 would follow without a fight. All they knew was that their supervisor had walked out the same week their own pay got threatened, and it looked, from where they stood, exactly like a man saving himself. That's the cruelest part of this whole story, and it's real. And it happens to people constantly. He'd absorbed the hit meant to soften up the rest of them, and they thought he'd ducked out before it landed. Walter knew exactly what it would look like. He walked out anyway, because doing the right thing and getting credit for it are two completely different transactions, and most days you only get one of them. Diane Kessler, being Diane Kessler, did not sit with the loss for long. It took her about 6 hours to find somebody else. His name was Perry Hutchins, second shift supervisor, Building A, 4 years with the company, a man who'd been angling for Walter's seniority for at least 2 of them. When Diane called Perry into her office and laid out the same 22%, framed the same way, regional benchmarks, standardized pay grades, effective the first of the month, Perry Hutchins didn't close a folder. Perry Hutchins asked one question. Does this help me move up if I sign? She told him it would, and Perry signed the acknowledgement form, and by Friday afternoon, all 12 names on the original list had accepted the restructuring, because once the senior man's slot showed no resistance behind it in writing, the other 10 who'd been wavering fell in line the way Diane had always known they would. A public fold, even one that looked like a resignation from the outside, taught everyone else in that building exactly what happened if they didn't sign. It was done quietly. It was filed under Operational Standardization, Q3, Building CA realignment. And for a little while, it was, by Diane's measure, a complete success. Except, a thing like that doesn't stay quiet. It never does. It came apart because of a document Walter never meant as a weapon.
He hadn't leaked anything. He hadn't called a reporter or a lawyer or the union rep out of Warren. He'd simply refused to sign the acknowledgement form on a Wednesday morning, in writing, in front of 30 people, and then he'd gone home. But a refusal to sign leaves a mark. HR software doesn't forget who was asked first. There was a record, Form W4471R, Walter's employee number stamped right on it, unsigned, dated the 9th, sitting in a personnel file next to Perry Hutchins' signed acknowledgement dated the same afternoon, 6 hours later, with a note in the margin about a supervisory reclassification for Hutchins, effective the following quarter. 2 forms, same restructuring, one man who said no first, and one who said yes right after and got a promotion for it. For weeks, nobody on that floor knew any of this existed. They just knew Rosie Doyle's father wasn't picking her up from soccer practice in the same truck anymore, because he'd started driving for a distribution center out of Salt Springs Road to cover the gap while he looked for something permanent. They knew Walter Doyle had gone quiet. They knew he didn't come around Rico's anymore. And they still, every one of them, thought he'd run. Until a man named Ray Duffy, second shift lead in Building C, the loudest voice in that parking lot the night the story first took hold, filed a wage complaint of his own 6 weeks later over his own reduced check, and in doing it requested the paperwork behind the whole restructuring, and found 2 forms, one signed, one not, and a name on the unsigned one that everybody in that plant had spent 6 weeks calling a coward.
Ray Duffy drove out to Lincoln Avenue on a Saturday morning with about 11 other men from Building C riding in 3 trucks behind him, and he stood on Walter Doyle's front porch with his cap in both hands and couldn't get a word out for almost 10 seconds. Rosie answered the door first, 12 years old, in a soccer jersey, looking out at 11 grown men standing in her front yard like she'd opened the door onto the wrong house. "Is your dad home, sweetheart?" Walter came to the door in a t-shirt and jeans, and when he saw who it was, he didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who'd been expecting this conversation for 6 weeks and had just been waiting to find out which Saturday it landed on. "We said things about you," Duffy said. His voice was doing something it hadn't done in front of other men in a long time. "You ran." "I know. It's what it looked like. I'd have said the same thing standing where you were standing." "You knew what we'd think. You knew, and you walked anyway." Duffy's voice cracked on the next part. "Why would you let us hate you for it?" Walter shrugged, standing in his doorway with his daughter half behind him. "Because you can't do the right thing and also control what people think of you, Duff. You only get one. Most people pick the second one." He shrugged again. "I picked the first." Duffy told him the rest of it standing right there in the yard. The wage complaint, the 2 forms, W4471R sitting unsigned next to Hutchins's signature and his new title. Told him the whole floor knew now. Told him it was Walter's name on the form that never got signed and Walter's job that never got saved, and it was Walter who took the cut first so the other 11 of them would fold quiet, and instead he'd walked out the door with nothing and let every one of them call him a coward for 6 weeks while he drove a delivery van at night to keep the lights on. Rosie was standing behind her father's arm the whole time, 12 years old, hearing for the first time what her dad's silence had actually cost him and why. It went up the chain fast after that, the way these things do once there's a paper trail and a dozen furious men willing to sign statements. Past Diane Kessler's office, into a regional HR review, into a folder some VP in Columbus didn't want his name anywhere near. Briggs Foundry Group reversed the restructuring inside of 3 weeks, backpaid the 12 men the difference for every week it had been in effect, and quietly moved Perry Hutchins' new title into a performance review that would follow him for a long time. Diane Kessler didn't lose her job. The world is rarely that clean. But she lost the thing she'd built her whole career on, which was certainty. She drove out to Lincoln Avenue herself, alone, on a Tuesday evening, and stood on Walter Doyle's porch in a blazer that didn't belong on that street, and asked her the question she'd been unable to put down for 3 weeks. "I need to understand how you did it.
Not why, how. There was something raw in it. I checked you. Before I ever brought you into that room, I checked you the way I check everyone. One income, no second account on record, a truck with 200,000 miles on it. You were the most trapped man in the building. Yeah, that's why you picked me. How do you walk out with a daughter at home and no backup? I had savings. You just couldn't see them because I never spent them on anything you could look at. He nodded towards the truck in the driveway. That's the reason that truck is still running. The birthday parties Rosie didn't get, that's the reason too. I wasn't being cheap, Miss Kessler. I was buying something. One thing, the ability to stand up and walk out of a room like that one. Bought it a little at a time for 11 years because I watched a good man get forced to sign something dishonest once when I was 23, and he didn't fold because he was weak. He folded because he was broke. He looked at her steady. You didn't lose because I'm braver than the other 11. I'm not. You lost because I could afford it and they couldn't. Courage isn't a virtue in a room like that, ma'am. It's a balance sheet. And the freedom to say no when it actually costs you something isn't summoned in the moment. It's built for years beforehand, quietly, boringly, out of an old truck and a skipped birthday party and 100 small refusals to be owned. Diane Kessler stood on that porch a long time before she answered. That's the most damning thing anyone has ever said to me. A pause. And it's true. Every single person who ever folded for me, I made sure they were folded before I ever asked them. She offered him his job back. Then more than that, his old title, a raise, a number well above what he was making before any of it. The reflex of a person who only speaks one language. Walter turned it down. With respect, he said, you're offering me a longer leash. That's all a raise ever is, coming from someone who's already shown me she'll pull it. What he asked for instead, he asked for on paper, and not just for himself. A written policy, plant-wide. No employee can be reclassified or have base pay reduced without 30 days of written notice and the right to formally object without risk of termination or retaliation during a review period. Not a value statement, a mechanism, a door in the wall. You want to make sure this never happens again, he told the regional office 2 weeks later in a meeting room that wasn't conference room B. It's this. Make it so a man doesn't have to have $60,000 saved up just to be allowed to say no to something wrong. Right now, in this company and about 1,000 others, the only people who can afford principals are the ones who don't need the paycheck. That's not a workplace. That's a hostage situation with a dental plan. They put it in writing. It's still posted on the board outside Building C, and the men on that floor call it, without anybody telling them to, Doyle's Clause. Rosie Doyle never said another word about the truck. In fact, and Walter only found this weeks later, from a note her English teacher sent home, Rosie had been assigned to write about the most impressive person she knew, and she'd written about her father, about an account in Warren, Ohio, and 11 years of a truck nobody was proud of, and what all of it had actually been for. One night at the kitchen table on Lincoln Avenue, she asked him quiet, "Dad, all the stuff we never bought, that was for this, wasn't it?" Walter put his fork down. "I never bought us nice things, Rosie. I bought us something better. I bought us the ability to stand up and walk out of a room." I tapped the table once. "Nice things are what you buy when you're planning to stay quiet. I bought us the ability to stay free. I know it cost you a truck you weren't proud of and a party you didn't get, but when they told me to take less than 12 years was worth, I got to say no. Most people don't get to say no, not because they're worse than me, because they can't afford it." He smiled, tired. "That's what all those years of no were for, kid. They were for one yes. Here's the uncomfortable part, and it isn't about a CEO or a foundry. It's about the reader. Most people don't accept an unfair deal because they're weak. They accept it because they can't afford not to. Diane Kessler understood that better than almost anyone, and she was right about nearly everyone she ever tested it on. A man tied to a monthly number doesn't get to have principles. He gets to have regrets. Courage isn't a personality trait. It's a balance sheet. And the freedom to say no when it actually costs you something isn't summoned in the moment. It's built for years beforehand, quietly, boringly, out of an old truck in a skipped birthday party and 100 small refusals to be owned. Diane Kessler stood on that porch a long time before she answered. That's the most damning thing anyone has ever said to me. A pause. And it's true. Every single person who ever folded for me, I made sure they were folded before I ever asked them. She offered him his job back. Then more than that, his old title, a raise, a number well above what he was making before any of it. The reflex of a person who only speaks one language. Walter turned it down. With respect, he said, you're offering me a longer leash. That's all a raise ever is, coming from someone who's already shown me she'll pull it. What he asked for instead, he asked for on paper, and not just for himself. A written policy, plant-wide. No employee can be reclassified or have base pay reduced without 30 days of written notice and the right to formally object without risk of termination or retaliation during a review period. Not a value statement, a mechanism, a door in the wall. You want to make sure this never happens again, he told the regional office 2 weeks later in a meeting room that wasn't conference room B? It's this. Make it so a man doesn't have to have $60,000 saved up just to be allowed to say no to something wrong. Right now, in this company and about 1,000 others, the only people who can afford principals are the ones who don't need the paycheck. That's not a workplace. That's a hostage situation with a dental plan. They put it in writing. It's still posted on the board outside Building C, and the men on that floor call it, without anybody telling them to, Doyle's Clause. Rosie Doyle never said another word about the truck. In fact, and Walter only found this weeks later, from a note her English teacher sent home, Rosie had been assigned to write about the most impressive person she knew, and she'd written about her father, about an account in Warren, Ohio, and 11 years of a truck nobody was proud of, and what all of it had actually been for. One night at the kitchen table on Lincoln Avenue, she asked him quiet, "Dad, all the stuff we never bought, that was for this, wasn't it?" Walter put his fork down. "I never bought us nice things, Rosie. I bought us something better. I bought us the ability to stand up and walk out of a room." I tapped the table once. "Nice things are what you buy when you're planning to stay quiet. I bought us the ability to stay free. I know it cost you a truck you weren't proud of and a party you didn't get, but when they told me to take less than 12 years was worth, I got to say no. Most people don't get to say no, not because they're worse than me, because they can't afford it." He smiled, tired. "That's what all